Welcome to Recap Our Studio.
The film begins on board the Honest DoD, the slave ship on which Sink and his crew are traveling in an effort to reclaim their freedom. Sink painstakingly removes wood off the ship in order to get to a nail stuck in it. In an effort to start a rebellion, he uses the nail to liberate himself and his fellow slaves. There's violence on both sides, but in the end Sink manages to murder the captain and take over his ship. The next day, with all the slaves on board free, they rescue 2 members of the crew and return them to Africa. The reluctant sailor apparently agrees and sets sail in the direction of the east. Not to be too much of a Boy Scout, but the west is where it's at. They are obviously not returning to Africa. That night, when it realizes it can't put faith in the man's decision-making, it takes control of the ship and steers in a different direction. They wake up and put their faith in the sailor once more as they proceed east. In the course of their voyage, they come encounter another ship out at sea and just avoid colliding with it. Crew members are starting to feel the effects of the ship's 6-week journey, and the ship is now sinking as a result. They're about to starve to death unless they can locate land in America quickly. Thankfully, their voyage has taken a detour that has led them to America, a slave nation. When they were out on their land-based foraging expedition, a Navy vessel finds them and takes everyone aboard hostage. A black guy on a bicycle sped away from them, scared, and that should have been their first sign. Queen Isabel of Spain was the first of many youthful monarchs to be crowned. As a result of her advanced years, hardly one takes her seriously. She has a little role and exists mostly in the background. What matters most about her is that she learns about the Mossad and continues to annoy the Americans about it. A message regarding the Amistad slaves is also sent to the 8th president, Martin Van Buren. Being a people pleaser is one of his main goals in life. If you've seen the movie, you know he's a pushover who's solely interested in staying in office. The film opens with Morgan Freeman's portrayal of Theodore Jetson, an abolitionist and former slave. Both of these figures would play larger roles later on. He is business partners with Tappan, a wealthy abolitionist who is also successful in business. When many parties dispute ownership of the slaves in court, things get much more confusing. The claim to the slaves has been ceded to the Queen of Spain by imperial order and treaty. However, both the original owners and the sailors who discovered them have staked claims to the objects as booty from their respective trips. All of the judges and lawyers in the courtroom get agitated as the moral and legal issues raised by the case are discussed. Following the chaos, since Roger Baldwin is a specialist in real estate conflicts, he decides to contact Tapping about being a representative for Tapp and his abolitionist organization. He hopes that by assisting in tapping and gaining control of the slaves, he may both further his career as a prominent attorney and release the slaves. He would be competing with attorney Halliburton for their business if he were to accept the position. President John Quincy Adams of the 6th United States is contacted by Tapping in the hopes of gaining the president's support for his initiatives for free Sink and his people. Adams is an elderly guy, yet he has retained his independence and sage wisdom. During his administration, Adams intended to end slavery but never got around to it. It's not that he doesn't agree with them, but he's decided he's too old and worn out to do anything about it. They had to rely on Roger Baldwin once again for campaign assistance after losing the support of John Quincy Adams. Roger argues that acquiring a slave is illegal unless the child is born into servitude. If they are not really slaves, then the items have been illegally transferred from one person to another. Given that they are human beings and not cattle, it is very improbable that they were born into servitude. Therefore, they should not be subject to slavery, as befits their status as free men. Despite Roger's apathy, this event has occurred, and Theodore remains steadfast in his abolitionist beliefs. As both Americans and Christians, they consider it their moral obligation to set the slaves free. While Roger is focused on the case and being paid, a group of his fellow captives breaks into a rousing rendition of Amazing Grace in the cell where they are being confined. If Roger drops over to visit him, of course. Slaves quarrel about where to put a table in the cramped yard. Roger and Theodore have brought a translator to in an effort to interact with the slaves and obtain material for their case, but the translator has no clue what he's doing. He makes up nonsense and translates imprecise advice. Slaves participate in vain and get nothing for their cause. Unsure of who to stand with among the racists who want them dead or in chains and the Christians who want them free, the slaves behave belligerently against everyone. Not long after Yamba, one of the slaves is given a Bible. The trial has turned into a spectacle for the townspeople. The prosecutor, the Spanish, and the abolitionists make up the three major factions. Roger shows the guys how it's obvious that the slaves weren't born on the property. Lacking the ability to speak either English or Spanish suggests they were not brought up in a slave environment. Unfortunately, his case is thrown out because the Spanish presented the court with a forged bill of sale. The court dismisses Roger's case since he has no proof to provide. In the evening, he resolves to try to get in touch with Roger. Since he's attempting to help, he's learning the language a little at a time. He's sympathetic to their plight, having once faced a similar challenge himself. Context cues need some work, but they let them to convey how far sinking people have journeyed to America. The following day, with the use of a search warrant, Roger and Theodore combed through the Amistad in search of evidence in their case. Theodore discovers what seems to be an animal tooth, and Roger discovers a shiplock among the wreckage of the vessel. It turns out that the ship's log is really the manifest for an entirely other vessel. All of the paperwork the Spanish were provided was fake. These papers are from the notorious slave ship Decorah, which carried out unlawful slave trade. Due to the overwhelming weight of evidence, the Spanish argument is completely disregarded. From now on, whenever I allude to persons of African descent, I will call them Africans rather than slaves. This is such a compelling piece of evidence that it strongly supports the abolitionists' position. A random bigot outside the courtroom decides to smack Roger over the head because he believes they're going to win the case. Both the American and Spanish populations are upset by this circumstance. Despite the fact that the United States is deeply divided and on the verge of civil war, slave-owning Spain seeks to persuade it to accept the Africans. The situation necessitates the intervention of the sitting president, Van Buren, who would have to replace the whole jury and the presiding judge. He cares far more about winning re-election than he does about the emancipation of certain Africans. They're basically asking for aid while cheating. Theodore goes to see John Adams for some guidance. He, like everyone else, has been following the case closely. But his single piece of advice is that they're still lacking a major piece of evidence. While they may have uncovered their origins, they have yet to fully understand who they are. They aren't getting to know the human aspect of their narrative. Motivated people are more than just a spark in a dark corner. At the jail, Roger and Theodore make an effort to learn the inmates' language and recruit an African American who is fluent in it. A member of the African group has passed away, and his family has insisted on burial him in the traditional way. The new translator, Shiyaga, also goes by the name James Kobe. The British Navy freed him from a slave ship, and he hasn't looked back since. When Roger seeks for aid, he describes the problem to Cinque, who is so confused by the politics of the matter that he almost quits up. Roger urges that Cinque address the court on behalf of his people and tells the account of how Cinque killed a lion. Cinque, being the modest guy that he is, claims that he was only rescued by chance. Not believing that, Roger understands it required bravery to rescue his people on the slave ship. If they want to win the case, he says, he can't let his testimony wreck the ship. A flashback reveals that Cinque and his people were sold into slavery by an enemy tribe in exchange for weapons and ammunition. It was probably an attempt to gain control. Now we know that even a newborn was crammed into one of the cramped quarters beneath the ship with the rest of them evidence of the inhumane treatment they endured. The bodies were dumped overboard. Women were exploited and men flogged. It's a disturbing scene to take in. They're given garbage to eat, and the ill are often turned away. A large number of slaves are sent overboard and drown. After a difficult voyage, the slaves finally reach Cuba, where they are sold at auction to the Amistad. The new judge hears the narrative, and the audience is visibly moved. But Holabird is certain that Africans have always practiced slavery, they too own slaves. To them, however, being enslaved is more akin to being a worker than it is to the American idea of slavery. The next witness is a British official who speaks about how British law prohibits slavery, but he has changed his statement. He believes that the weight loss in the report is directly related to the slaves being thrown overboard, which is consistent with many of the accounts and the sinking tale. Despite the obvious presence of a slave trade, his soldiers have been unable to locate the source. Back in the jail, the session comes to a dramatic conclusion as Cinque breaks out, saying, "Give us free." Jamba has been reading the Bible he was given some time ago, and he has been sharing what he has learned about Christian doctrine with people at. Having been profoundly affected by biblical narratives, he provides Cinque with a summary of the life of Jesus. And tomorrow, on the day of the final hearing, I guess you could say he's a Christian now. After hearing all of the evidence, the judge shocks everyone by deciding to release the Africans. Further, he has Spanish officials detained for their involvement in the slave trade. With one stroke of Rogers' sword, his people won their independence. At least for the time being. Upon returning to the capital, President Van Buren hosts a feast for the Spanish ambassador. A senator from the South stormed the celebration and, in a cowardly display of passive aggressiveness, threatened a civil war. He files an appeal, taking the matter all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. They'll have to start from the beginning again. Again, you can probably guess that Sinky isn't handling the news very well. Despite having won the lawsuit, the South is not giving in and accepting their victory. With no other choices left, of course. Roger writes to President John Quincy Adams pleading for assistance. In the next months, Robert loses all of his business, Van Buren's re-election campaign stalls, and he gets many death threats. As time goes on, John Quincy Adams works to find a means to assist Robert in his cause, having previously agreed to do so. Adams and CNK spend some time together in his garden and have a one-on-one session in which CNK outlines the complexities of the upcoming predicament. Words fail me to describe the profound and moving dialogue they have. Basically, Sinky has developed a strong affection for the ex-president and views the events of the present as the ultimate fulfillment of his life's destiny. Movies with this many lengthy speeches are notoriously difficult to sum up. When President Adams first addresses the Supreme Court, he launches into a lengthy speech in which he criticizes the South for its lack of commitment to the idea that freedom lies at the heart of the Declaration of Independence. A privilege that slave owners have ignored for far too long. It's safe to say that not everyone would see Sinkin as heroic if he was white. There is no real estate at stake, the problem is racial. It would be the same as tearing up the Declaration of Independence, he continues, if they denied the rights of Africans. Whence do civil conflicts emerge? Yes, then let it be the last clash of the American Revolution. Everyone in the room is moved to silence by the oratory. A single night of debate leads the court to declare the inhabitants of the sinking to be free. They were well within their rights to rebel against those who oppressed them. At the film's conclusion, the two main characters, Robert and the submerged woman, express their gratitude to one another in their respective native tongues. Slaves are used to raid and destroy the castle. Slavery was abolished, and President Van Buren was not re-elected. When civil war breaks out over America, the Queen of Spain finally gives up trying to help. When Sinclair finally gets back to his homeland, he finds that his own people are embroiled in a civil war. No one is left in his family, and his hometown was leveled. It is likely that they were also trafficked into slavery. Everyone's story has a sad finish, having its foundation in actual events. The terrible and dismal past of the United States of America is explored in depth. If John Quincy Adams had been there from the start, do you think they would be very different today?